Hello, welcome back. If you're new here, hello, welcome. My name is Charlie, and I spend a lot of my time reading. It's probably the thing I spend most of my time doing, but I wasn't always like this. I loved reading as a kid, and then like a lot of people, I went to school, and school turned reading, this fun thing that I like to do, into homework. You know, we were forced to read a lot of books that we didn't really want to read, and we were forced to read them at a pace that we didn't want to read at, and it kind of sucked all the joy out of it, at least for me. But a few years ago, I got back into it in a major way, and I haven't stopped since. Actually, I tried getting back into it several times over the years, like since graduating from high school and like college and all that, and nothing really stuck until 2022. And so now I've had 3 full years of reading regularly, and I fully attribute that to a few key things that I do regularly, a few kind of tricks or tips that I used that have definitely helped me find my way back to the hobby. And I think they might help you too. I don't think any of these are really like groundbreaking things, and I probably, I didn't invent these things. Some of them are gonna sound really dumb, and some of them are definitely gonna come across as like counterintuitive, but I swear by all these things. I keep them all in mind, and I do them all intentionally, constantly, and for me it's been a huge help. I think these kind of tips could help anybody. If you are an avid reader but you found yourself in sort of a reading slump, and also if you are new to the hobby or want to get back into it, I think these are all great things to keep in mind. My furnace is broken and it is freezing cold in my basement office, so I'm just gonna dive right into it. My first tip, and this is definitely the one that's gonna feel counterintuitive, and probably honestly is my biggest tip, or like the best one that I have on this list. I think it's probably one that I should save for the end of the video, like from like a content creator's mindset, but I really want you to hear this. This is something that I wish I got comfortable with years ago, and I think it would have saved me a lot of grief over the years on my kind of reading journey or whatever. This is a surefire way to get yourself out of a reading slump if you're in it, and honestly, it's a great way to prevent reading slumps in general. So my first tip for reading more books is actually to DNF books that aren't working for you. DNF means did not finish. So do not finish that book. If reading currently feels like a chore and you're forcing yourself to sit down with a book and you're forcing yourself through these sentences and you're finding your mind wandering and you're not focusing, you sit down to read for an hour, you scroll on your phone for most of that hour, and by the end of it, you've read a page or two. It's not because you don't like reading, it's because the book you're reading isn't working for you. That's okay. Put it down. Stop reading that book. You don't like it. The book won't be offended when you put it back on the shelf. You're not going to have your status as a reader revoked. It's not quitting. It's not failing to finish a book. There are no prizes awarded for forcing yourself to finish it, especially if you're not connecting with it. Even if you're reading it as part of a buddy read or book club or anything like that, forcing yourself through it will usually result in you having nothing to add to those conversations anyway. Close the book, put it back on the shelf, and move on to the next one. It's possible that it's just not the right time for you and that book to connect. So put it on the shelf, and if you really want to get back to it at some point, you can try it again. Maybe it'll stick at that point. But it's also okay if that doesn't happen and you just never pick that book up again. That's fine. DNFing is much more of a victory than a failure. You are asserting your dominance over that book. You are giving yourself the gift of time, essentially. It takes me a lot longer to read a book that I don't like than it does to read a book that I do like. Back in 2022, when I was first getting back into reading, this is when I learned this lesson. This was before I learned it. I was reading The Vegetarian. I hate this book. I don't know. It's not a bad book, I'm sure. It's got a lot going for it, I guess, because it's won a bunch of awards. I think it even won like the Nobel Prize. It was not for me. I picked it up because I wanted to get into reading, and this is a book that people who are into reading seem to like. So if I want to be a person that likes reading, I should read this book and I will like this book. So I struggled through it for, I think, like a month or two. It's not a very big book. It took me forever and I didn't like it. Again, it's not a bad book, but it wasn't for me. I'm not mad that I tried to read that book. That's fine. But I definitely should not have finished that book. I finished that book at the very beginning of March in 2022, and I didn't pick up my next book for 5 months. Why would I? Why would I risk putting myself through an experience like that again? Or I'm wasting hours over the course of weeks or months or whatever to, force myself through something that I'm not enjoying. That was dumb. I should have just put it down. I can guarantee that I would have gotten really into reading a lot sooner if I did. I still struggle with this sometimes. Like last year, I probably should have DNF'd 2 books that I ended up finishing, but I don't know. I wasn't hating them, and I felt like maybe they'll change, but they didn't change. They ended up at 2 to 3 stars for me. And, that's fine, but I could have read some 4-star books if I just put those down sooner. I did end up DNFing 1 book last year, and I made it 400 pages into that book before I finally let myself put it down with only 100 pages left or something like that. But that was great. I felt so good when I wanted to read and I didn't have to pick that book up again, because it was just a drag for me. It wasn't something I was enjoying. It's just a waste of time, and it's just going to put a bad taste in your mouth and make you not want to read. When you put down that book that you're not connecting with, you can instead pick up a book that is better suited for you. And that kind of brings me into our next tip, which is to diversify your reading. Like I said, The Vegetarian was not for me. I didn't know that at the time that I picked up the book, but it turned out to be this sort of contemporary literary fiction, which apparently not what I needed at that point. Maybe just not my thing in general. So after 5 months of not wanting to read, I decided to pick up another book, and I went in a completely different direction. Instead of trying to read something that I felt like I should read, I really thought about what I thought I might enjoy, what I wanted to read. Imagine that, right? What a concept. But really, that was where I was. I didn't know yet what kind of books I was into. So I thought, I like Greek mythology. I'll pick up Mythos by Stephen Fry. I loved Mythos by Stephen Fry. And so I was like, okay, cool. I like Greek mythology. And I read 2 more, Song of Achilles and Circe. I read those, back to back, and that was great. And then I thought, okay, maybe Greek mythology, I can feel it getting a little stale potentially. So let's shift gears. What else do I like? Big monsters. Sure. So I read The Kaiju Preservation Society. Fantastic book. All right. That was sci-fi. So, let's think. What other sci-fi books have I liked? I liked The Martian. So then I read Project Hail Mary. Loved that book. We were getting close to October by that point. So, all right, I'll pick up a horror book. I got My Best Friend's Exorcism. Had a good time with it. And then I finally let my friend talk me into reading Mistborn, my first kind of fantasy book. And it was over from there. The rest is history. Then I went on this huge fantasy binge, which it really wasn't something that historically I had ever really considered reading. It just didn't feel like the right thing to do for whatever reason. Even though knowing myself now, of course I was going to like that book, or of course I was going to like that genre. I don't know why I didn't let myself do that sooner. It just felt like I should be reading all these other things. I'm kind of still on this big fantasy binge that I've been on for a few years, but I always like to sprinkle in other kinds of books as well. And I don't just mean genre even. I'm reading a lot of really big books kind of all the time, because a lot of fantasy books just tend to be large. But I like to break that up with a bunch of shorter books in between. Novellas, I'm really into that. I like reading a quick novella between a couple of tomes. And yeah, also genres, right? I read a lot of fantasy, but some sci-fi and some nonfiction here and there, and then some just other kinds of fiction, and horror and whatever, mythology retellings or reimaginings, things like that. Diversify. It helps me a ton. So when you're struggling to finish a book, DNF it, and then look in a completely different direction when you try to pick up your next read. And honestly, I don't even just mean to diversify in genre or length of book I mentioned, right? But also try diversifying the type of book you're reading. By that I mean more, reading a physical book or an audiobook or an ebook. I personally love going between format, and it keeps it fresh. It keeps it going for me, which kind of brings me into my next couple tips, honestly. The first of those is that I love reading multiple books at the same time. And this, again, is maybe one that seems counterintuitive because, if you're reading 5 books at the same time, how are you ever going to find time to finish all of those? First of all, time is fake. And so, take your time with it. You should, read what you want when you want it and just enjoy it, take it in, take your time with the books. But also when you're reading multiple books, you kind of always have something that you're in the mood for. This doesn't work for everyone, I'm sure, but for me, it's been a huge help. Sometimes I'll be reading a book and I'm enjoying this book, but it kind of demands a slower pace, or it demands that I really think about the words as I'm reading them. And that's fine, but I personally need to be in the right headspace for that kind of book. So on a really thinky book, to use Sam Harrison's term, I kind of need to read those books, like a brain heavy book, in the morning or sometime during the day. Because if I pick that book up and I sit down in bed to read it, I'm asleep. I'm falling asleep in a couple pages. I don't have the space for it in my brain, or the energy for it in my brain at that point. So I'll put my brain heavy book as, a daytime read or a morning read. I put that on my little table in front of the couch where I'll read in the morning sometimes. And then at night, if I do want to read something, I'll pick up a different book entirely, one that is a little more brainless, like a thoughtless book. It's just a fun time, a fast pace, an exciting, engaging story. I'll also typically make that nighttime book like an ebook, because then I can make the font really big, which helps for a couple reasons. I don't know if it's because my brain just can't focus on the little letters as well at night, or if it's just, I get to turn the page more because the page is more filled up, on your ebook or your e-reader. So you're kind of constantly moving your hand too, which keeps you awake. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's why that works. It sounds silly, but again, it works for me. And then on top of those 2 books, I'll typically always have, or not typically, I always have an audiobook going also. I'm not the kind of person that can just sit down and listen to an audiobook and stare into space. And I'm also not the type of person who can do any sort of task that requires thinking or focus. I tried to do a puzzle while listening to an audiobook recently, and it was fun, but I lost track of where I was in the book and I had to rewind a lot, things like that. But if I'm washing the dishes or folding laundry or walking the dog, any sort of menial task that requires literally no thoughts between my ears, I have an audiobook in. It makes doing these chores way better. Now, sometimes I do overdo this personally. Right now I'm reading 6 different books at the same time, and that's a little much. Start with 2 or 3 if you want, maybe, but it works for me. Currently I'm reading 6 awesome books, and so the hardest thing is that I don't know which one I want to read sometimes, but I always have something that I'm in the mood for right now. So that's been great. I never have to force myself to sit down and read a book, because they're all really good options. I'm always in the mood for one of the books that I'm reading, which wouldn't be the case if I was reading one book. Like I said, if I was reading a brain heavy book and I wanted to read at night, I couldn't do that as effectively, or I wouldn't enjoy it as much. So having options keeps me going in the habit, keeps me moving. And then sort of tangentially related, another benefit of getting into the habit of reading different formats of books, so reading physical books and reading audiobooks, is this idea of immersion reading. I love immersion reading. Immersion reading, if you're not familiar with the term, is when you are physically reading a book, with your eyes reading a book, but at the same time, you have your headphones in and you are listening to that book, the same book. Having 2 senses kind of focused on the same words is a great way to really get into the story and keep your focus on what you're reading. Especially if I'm having one of those moments where I'm finding my eyes kind of slipping, gliding around the page as I'm reading. This really helps you just even if they wander, that's okay, because you're still getting the story, and then you can find your place and pick back up. So immersion reading helps with those moments of a lack of visual focus when you want to be sitting down with a book. Now, it's expensive to buy a book in multiple formats, and I'm not necessarily encouraging that you do that. But what I do with this is I will buy a book physically, and then I'll check my library and get it on audio using apps like Hoopla. And sometimes I'll do that the other way around. I'll buy the audiobook and I'll get the physical copy from the library. I've managed a couple times to get both versions from the library, but for some reason that's much harder to do. I know not everybody has a good library system. Mine's decent, but you can always always request a book at your library too. Like if they don't have it, you can make a request for it. And a lot of times they will get it for you. So I mentioned that immersion reading helps when I'm having those moments of like a lack of focus, right? But again, I know it's not for everybody. So my next tip is good for exactly those same kinds of moments. This one's going to seem dumb. I know that it's going to make me seem illiterate, but I'm not. And I swear by this trick. If you are losing your focus and your eyes are drifting around the page and you keep having to reset yourself at the beginning of the paragraph and you read a little bit more and then you go back to the beginning of the paragraph because it's all being lost, nothing is sticking, take your little finger, put it under the word that you're reading, and then just follow along with your finger. Literally point to the word and drag your finger as you read. What I do honestly with this one is I'll take the bookmark that I'm using anyway, and I'll just like hold it kind of under the line of text that I'm reading, blocking what's below it. And then when I get to the end of the line, I'll just shift it down a line. I'll shift it down a line after that. Again, it sounds stupid, I know that, but I swear it works. It keeps your hand busy, and then it gives your eyes sort of like one additional physical cue of what you want your eyes to focus on. Usually I only need to do this for like a page or two, and then it clicks, and then I don't need it anymore. Then I can put the bookmark down, or I can put my hand away and just like, then I'll be fine. Then my focus is locked in. But it's a really helpful tool to help me like reset my focus, and then I can go back to reading like an adult. I think that was actually 5 tips right there. So I should probably end the video and just, call this like 5 tips for getting into reading or whatever, but I have one more, and so I'm going to tell you this last one, and I think this one's really good too. If you want to read more books, I strongly encourage you to talk about the books that you want to read or the books that you are reading. This is going to mean something different for everybody, and the way that you do this will change over time, but really, I think you should do this. Talking about the books that you're reading is half the fun. Being able to talk to my friend about Mistborn when I was finally getting into that book enhance the experience in ways that I cannot measure. You could join a book club or a buddy read, or you could just ask a friend if they want to read a book that you're interested in. Or maybe you can ask a friend to recommend a book that they loved, and then you can read it with the intention of, once you finish it, you can talk to them about it. They'll love that, I promise. And if you don't know a lot of people in real life that read in general, or that read the kinds of books that you like, go to the internet. There's a lot of people on the internet. The book-loving community, I have found, save for like a few fandoms that are really intense and hardcore, has been really welcoming and really engaging, and it's been great. So join it. I guess I don't even necessarily mean that you have to talk about the books, but engage with the books more than just reading it. Read a book, then go online and watch a review of it. That's super fun. If you watched that video and you thought it was fun, comment on that video. Smaller channels, especially like mine, are specifically seeking out comments like yours. They made that video because they want to talk about the book that they are talking about in that video. So if you leave a nice comment talking about how you also liked that thing that they mentioned, or you liked this other thing that they didn't mention, I can almost guarantee that they'll reply and engage with your comment, and you can have a little bit of a back and forth, and you can share your thoughts. You can even just comment on somebody's review on like Goodreads or whatever, or join a book-related Discord server like I did. And if you are like me and you want to do even more than that, you can record yourself talking about books and put it on the internet. Hobbies are almost always improved by sharing them with other people. Talking about books online has been so much fun for me, and I've met a lot of people, a lot of them who I even consider friends at this point. Even if you feel like you read like weird, obscure books, I promise you're not the only one that's read it. There's an audience for everything, and so if you look for that community or people that have read that book and enjoyed it, you will find it. They do exist, I promise. And that's pretty much it. Those are all the things that I do regularly that help me keep up my motivation to read and help lock in my focus when I am reading. I do all of these, every single one, regularly, and they all help me keep up with the hobby. You don't have to read. Nobody has to read. But if you want to read, I think all of these things can help you to get into it. So I hope you'll try some of these things. And if you do, I hope they'll help. Thank you so much for watching. And if you have anything that you like to do that helps keep you going, share it in the comments. If any of these sound like something that you'd like to try, let me know that too. I will see you next week. Bye.